All right, let's go ahead and talk about some of the ways in which people criticize the New Deal, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's effort to alleviate some of the conditions experienced by the country during the Great Depression. Probably the most vocal critic of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's efforts to deal with the Great Depression is the Supreme Court itself. The United States Supreme Court declares several pieces of New Deal legislation unconstitutional. For instance, in the court case of Schechter versus the United States, the NIRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act, is declared unconstitutional. What had happened was a New York poultry company, they sold chicken, was accused of selling bad chicken against the regulations of the National Industrial Recovery Act. Schechter goes ahead and argues that this is unconstitutional because, in effect, it was the president who was making the rules that were enforced by the NIRA, and that's giving legislative power to the office of the president, and that's not permitted by the Constitution. The Supreme Court agreed, and it's one of the reasons why the NIRA was declared unconstitutional. Further, they said that the NIRA regulated trade within the borders of a state. Again, Congress is given broad authority to go ahead and regulate commerce amongst or between the different states, but is it given authority to regulate trade that exists within a state's borders? And the argument of Schechter was that no, it was not. And again, the Supreme Court agrees. So as a result, the NIRA is declared unconstitutional, which leads to the passage of two pieces of legislation, the Wagner Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act, both of them intended to replace the NIRA. The Wagner Act establishes what's called the National Labor Relations Board, which is still effective today and still goes ahead and rules on labor practices till this day. The second case is the U.S. versus Butler. It declares the AAA, or the Agricultural Adjustment Act, unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court says it's unconstitutional for a couple of reasons. One, they say it's a violation of states' rights. And two, they say that the Congress is not given the authority to regulate agriculture by the Constitution. So as a result, the Congress goes back to the drawing board and they pass the second AAA, which goes ahead and basically just restates the AA and just takes out the offending lines that the Supreme Court objected to. Certainly, the Supreme Court was not the only critic of the New Deal, however. There were folks who criticized the New Deal from the right or from the conservative perspective. These guys were called themselves the Liberty League. The Liberty League was a political action group, and they thought that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was doing too much. He was making government too big. He was taking on too much debt. And that he was doing more than what the government was intended to do. There were other folks who felt like Franklin Delano Roosevelt wasn't doing enough. These folks were on the left. Guys like Upton Sinclair, who was the progressive journalist and writer who wrote against the meatpacking industry and immigration and things like that. He says that Franklin Delano Roosevelt needs to be doing more, along with people like Francis Townsend, former governor of California, who believes that Roosevelt's not doing enough to alleviate the conditions that were oppressing people during the New Deal. Father Coughlin, an Irish Roman Catholic priest who had a radio show out of New York, again a critic of Roosevelt, that Roosevelt needed to do more to help people during the Great Depression. But probably the most significant critic from the left is probably a guy by the name of Huey Long. He was the senator from Louisiana. He had been the governor of Louisiana, incredibly influential in Louisiana politics, also notoriously corrupt. His nickname was the Kingfish, and he was well known to use his political power to punish people who disagreed with him, denying them funding and different things like that. But his big proposal was that the U.S. government needed to pay everybody $5,000 per year for every family. He never made any indication of how this would be paid for, of where they were going to get the money from, but nonetheless, he felt like every American family was entitled to at least $5,000 a year. So all of these people disagree with the New Deal, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt gets frustrated, specifically with the Supreme Court, because this was the only group that really had the authority and the power to limit what he could do. And so in order to get around the Supreme Court, he proposes what becomes known as, somewhat derogatorily, as the court packing bill. Basically what he says is the judges have to retire at 70. Of course, this is unconstitutional. The Constitution says that judges serve for a term of life. And so he knows he really actually can't, without amending the Constitution, force the judges to retire at age 70. So he puts a provision in there. If they choose not to, because of course they can choose not to, then the president gets to appoint a new judge who sits on the bench next to them. In other words, Franklin Delano Roosevelt would be able to appoint a liberal judge to sit next to the conservative judges. And it just so happens that most of your conservative judges were over 70. What this really was an attempt to make the Supreme Court more liberal so that they would agree with Roosevelt and his New Deal. He was making the Supreme Court political. In reality, the Supreme Court's always been somewhat political. You'll hear people today say, oh, lament the fact how political the judicial branch has become. It's always been so. all the way back to the founding of our nation. It's really nothing new. But this is one of the few things, the court packing bill, that backfires on FDR. The Congress doesn't pass it. The public views FDR as almost trying to be a dictator. Hey, where do you get off trying to control another branch of government? And so he backs off. He doesn't get the court packing bill. It never passes, never becomes law, because it does present some problems for FDR's image.